You're kneeling in burning sand, an iron collar biting into your neck, chained to 11 other women who won't meet your eyes because meeting eyes means remembering you're human. And right now, staying human will kill you. A man circles your group like he's examining livestock at a market. And that's exactly what this is. A market. And you're the merchandise. He grabs your jaw, forces your mouth open, checks your teeth like you're a horse, runs his fingers along your gums, presses your tongue down to examine your throat. He pulls back your eyelids, stares into your eyes with the clinical detachment of someone who's done this 10,000 times before. 12 days ago, you were a chief's daughter in your village. Your mother still alive. Your future your own. Now you're being sold for the third time in less than 2 weeks. And the Arabic word they use for you is jariya, slave girl. A word that means your body is merchandise and your future belongs to whoever bids highest. This happened. For over 1,000 years it happened. And for centuries afterward, the world spent its energy pretending it never existed at all. Welcome to Crown and Dagger, where we don't hide the stories history tried to bury. Everyone knows about the Atlantic slave trade. 12 million Africans transported across an ocean over 400 years. Museums built to remember them. Monuments erected. Textbooks written. But there was another trade, older and longer, that consumed possibly more lives, operated for 13 centuries, and remains almost completely unknown. The Arab slave trade began in the 7th century after the rise of Islam, and didn't officially end until the 20th century. Saudi Arabia abolished slavery in 1962, Mauritania not until 1981. Somewhere between 14 and 17 million Africans were taken, though the real number could be much higher because the records were deliberately poor, the documentation deliberately sparse. But here's the question that should haunt anyone who learns these numbers. America today has 45 million people of African descent from that 400-year trade. Generations of descendants ensuring that history can never be forgotten. The Middle East, after 1,300 years of slavery, has almost nothing. Scattered remnants, small communities in Yemen, southern Iraq, a few thousand in Morocco. Where did 14 million people go? The answer is the darkest part of this story, and it explains why there are no descendants to remember. 80 to 90% of African males taken in the Arab slave trade were systematically castrated. This wasn't random cruelty. It was systematic policy, and specific locations became notorious for it. Egyptian monasteries where Coptic Christian monks developed and refined the techniques generation after generation. The mortality rate was staggering. 3 to 5 men died from blood loss, infection, or shock for every one who survived. Do the mathematics on that, and it becomes almost incomprehensible. A trader who needed 100 living eunuchs might start his journey with 400 to 500 men, knowing most would die screaming in the desert. The purpose wasn't just economic. It was strategic and coldly calculated. Men who couldn't reproduce couldn't form families. Men without families couldn't create communities. Communities that didn't exist couldn't organize resistance, couldn't demand freedom, couldn't leave descendants who would remember and fight. They worked, they aged, they died, and they were replaced, generation after generation for 1,300 years, leaving nothing behind but bones in the sand. The women were kept fertile, but only because of what their bodies could produce. And the historical records tell this story in euphemisms and in the awful silences between words. Arab merchants operated as businessmen, not raiders. They didn't personally attack villages. They created sophisticated economic systems that incentivized Africans to capture and sell each other. Trade goods flowed into sub-Saharan Africa: guns, European firearms, sold through Arab middlemen, textiles, luxury items, and salt, which was precious in regions where it was scarce. Human beings flowed out. Major kingdoms built their entire economies on this trade. The Kingdom of Dahomey in modern-day Benin conducted annual slave raids as state policy. The Sultanate of Zanzibar controlled the East African trade routes. The Funj Sultanate dominated the Nile corridor. Various Tuareg groups controlled the trans-Saharan routes. It was self-perpetuating and brilliant in its horror. More guns meant more successful raids. More raids meant more captives. More captives meant more purchasing power. More purchasing power meant more guns. Villages were surrounded at dawn while people slept, then hit with sudden overwhelming assault. Men who resisted were killed immediately. Survivors were evaluated for age, health, and strength. Young, strong men were separated for castration and eventual sale. Older men with no market value were frequently killed on the spot because feeding them during the journey wasn't economically sensible. Women were evaluated by completely different criteria: age, with the ideal range being 13 to 25 years old, and physical appearance, which affected price dramatically. Different markets had different preferences, but Ethiopian women consistently commanded premium prices, selling for 2 to 3 times what women from other regions brought. The better treatment some received wasn't compassion, it was economics. Damaged merchandise sold for less. Families were separated immediately at capture sites or collection points. Lifetime bonds severed in moments that European witnesses said contained grief beyond description. Mothers torn from children, husbands from wives, sisters from brothers, people desperately clinging to each other while being beaten apart. One missionary wrote that the sounds haunted his dreams for years, that the screams followed him for decades after he left Africa. Those screams echoed across an entire continent for 1,300 years, and almost no one in the outside world heard them or cared to listen. Then came the journey itself, distances comparable to walking from New York to Denver in chains with almost no water. The routes from collection points to North African markets in Tripoli, Tunis, Cairo, or Marrakesh often exceeded 1,500 miles, some over 2,000. The journey took 2 to 3 months under optimal conditions, and conditions were never optimal. The Sahara is the largest hot desert on Earth where daytime temperatures regularly exceed 120 degrees, hot enough that the sand itself blisters exposed skin, with no shade for hundreds of miles. At night, temperatures drop below freezing. The temperature swing alone killed countless people. Water was brutally rationed because camels needed water to survive. Camels were expensive and essential, and slaves were cheaper and replaceable. Slaves received whatever water remained after the animals drank, lips cracking and bleeding, tongues swelling in mouths that stopped producing saliva. Food was minimal: dried dates, sometimes meat, enough to keep legs moving, but never enough to maintain health or strength. 20 to 30% died during the crossings. Some caravans lost half, some over 60%. There was no mercy for those who fell. Stopping would slow the caravan, threaten the valuable merchandise that was still walking, so collapsed people were left exactly where they fell, sometimes still alive but too weak to continue. The routes became marked by bones, the paths literally identifiable by the skeletal remains lining them. Heinrich Barth, a German explorer traveling through the Sahara in the 1850s, wrote that the road was literally strewn with skeletons, that in some valleys the bones were so numerous you couldn't avoid stepping on them. Skulls bleached white by the sun, rib cages half buried in sand, fresh additions to trails that were already 1,000 years old. Rene Cailly documented the western routes, describing valleys that appeared white from a distance because of the sheer density of bones covering the ground. Gustav Nachtigall wrote about regions where the concentration of skulls and bones gave the sand an almost pavement-like quality. Hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps millions over 13 centuries, creating a silent testimony marking the very paths that swallowed them, a history the world chose to ignore. For the women who survived to reach North African port cities, arrival meant the immediate dying had stopped, but the hidden damage was complete. Their bodies had made the journey, but their spirits had not, and the ordeal was only transforming into something else. The slave markets were ancient, refined institutions where Cairo's market operated continuously for over 1,000 years, each generation refining the practices, the pricing structures, the evaluation techniques. Buyers came from everywhere. Ottoman nobles from Constantinople, Persian merchants from Isfahan, wealthy Arabs from Damascus and Baghdad, traders from the Gulf states seeking domestic servants, even European buyers despite official prohibitions from their home countries. Markets were organized by category, separating common laborers from skilled workers from domestic servants, with the most exclusive areas behind screens where women were offered for private sale. The examination process was systematic and dehumanizing. They checked teeth first, because teeth indicated age and overall condition, letting buyers estimate how many useful years remained. Then skin, checking for disease, scars, or imperfections. Hair texture and length mattered. Then came the rest. Intimate and invasive examinations conducted with the detachment of a butcher evaluating livestock, and many European accounts of this were actually censored by publishers back home because the descriptions were too graphic. One British observer in the 1830s wrote that women were made to walk, turn, display themselves in every conceivable manner, examined as a horseman might examine a mare he is considering for purchase, with cold calculation and complete absence of anything resembling human feeling. Pricing varied wildly based on origin, appearance, and intended use. Common women sold for modest sums, those with more desirable features significantly more, while young virgins from preferred ethnic backgrounds could sell for amounts equivalent to several years' wages for an average worker. The highest prices were paid privately by agents purchasing for the wealthiest households, transactions the public markets never saw. Zanzibar at its peak saw 50,000 slaves pass through annually, the island's entire economy revolving around human merchandise. David Livingstone witnessed this firsthand, and his accounts galvanized British abolition efforts while changing him forever. He wrote that, to overdraw its evils is simply impossible. The subject does not admit of exaggeration. Describing sights so revolting he actively tried to drive them from his memory. The market officially closed in 1873, when the Sultan signed a treaty under British pressure, but the trade continued underground for decades afterward. Ships sailing at night, transactions in hidden locations, because the demand was too strong and the profits too large. After purchase, destinations varied, but the wealthiest buyers were building harems. Ottoman sultans maintained hundreds to thousands of women. The imperial harem at Topkapi Palace housed up to 2,000 at its peak. Lesser nobles kept smaller collections proportional to their wealth. Even moderately wealthy merchants might own several women. The harem was more than physical gratification. It was a political institution where women competed viciously for favor, because bearing a son meant everything. The mother of a future sultan wielded enormous power. Women schemed, formed alliances, undermined rivals, and poison was common enough to be almost routine. But first came systematic erasure of identity. You received a new name. Your original language was forbidden. Your religion was replaced. your entire past destroyed and rebuilt. You were taught new customs, new behaviors, new expectations, how to walk, how to serve, what was permitted and what would be punished. Eventually, nothing remained of the person you had been. History records rare success stories because they were extraordinary exceptions. Kozum Sultan, who began as a Greek village slave girl and dominated Ottoman politics for decades, or Hurrem Sultan, who became the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, almost unheard of for a former slave. We know their names precisely because they were exceptions. For every Kozum, thousands lived and died anonymous, used until they were no longer useful, then discarded and forgotten. For women purchased by less wealthy buyers, life meant domestic service with additional obligations: cooking, cleaning, raising children, and submitting whenever the owner desired, because there was no concept of consent, no option to refuse. Islamic law theoretically provided protections. A slave who bore her master's child was called Walid, mother of child, and couldn't be sold afterward. The child was born legally free, and the mother gained freedom when the master died. But these protections required enforcement that was inconsistent at best, only applied after pregnancy, and before pregnancy remained property. Whatever intimacy occurred was compelled, not chosen. Children born from these unions were legally free and often acknowledged, some achieving significant prominence. Multiple sultans were sons of slave mothers, but the mothers remained slaves unless explicitly freed. Over generations, these children married into Arab populations, their features blended, their African heritage diluted until it became invisible, until it vanished completely. This wasn't just erasure of individuals, but of their descendants, not just of lives, but of evidence those lives ever existed. The trade didn't end dramatically with proclamations or wars or moral awakenings. It faded gradually and reluctantly under external pressure. British naval power closed East African routes in the late 1800s. The Royal Navy actively hunted slave ships. Colonial administration suppressed the trans-Saharan trade. International pressure forced formal abolitions throughout the 20th century. The legacy isn't monuments or memorials, it's absence. The Middle East today has virtually no descendants of the 14 million taken there because the men were castrated and the women's children were absorbed into Arab populations until the heritage disappeared entirely. In Libya in 2020, a mass grave was discovered containing hundreds of remains. Analysis showed they were sub-Saharan Africans who died in the 18th or 19th century, almost certainly slaves who never finished crossing the Sahara, who collapsed and were left behind. They have no names in any record, no descendants to claim them, no one anywhere who remembers they lived, just bones in the desert. Silent evidence of a tragedy the world chose to forget. The Atlantic slave trade has 45 million descendants who ensure that history is never forgotten. The Arab slave trade has nothing but silence. 14 million people erased so completely we don't even have their names. That woman in the market whose teeth were examined, whose body was evaluated, whose humanity was stripped away. We will never know her name. Not the one her mother gave her. Not the one her village knew. We don't know if she ended up in a Cairo harem competing with dozens of others for scraps of attention, or a Baghdad household cooking and cleaning and submitting when called, or an Istanbul palace where she was forgotten the moment her youth faded. We don't know if she bore children who never learned her language or her songs or her stories or where she came from, or if she died in the desert, her bones joining the millions marking routes the world forgot. What we know is she existed. She suffered. She endured things no human should endure. And for 1,300 years, millions like her fed a machine designed to consume them completely. The Atlantic trade has monuments and museums and memorials and days of remembrance. This history has sand covering bones no one will identify. So remember her, not as a number or statistic, but as someone's daughter, someone who laughed once, someone who had a name before they erased it. This is the only memorial these 14 million will ever receive.